Hello, my name is Trudy Conway, and I've been a professor at Mount St. Mary's University for 35 years. Mount St. Mary's is the second oldest Catholic university in the country. And it's a pleasure to speak with you today about the role the Church is playing in the international repeal of the death penalty. Pope Benedict spoke very powerfully to the world community about the need to end this practice. And he called Catholics to become very active in this international effort. The U.S. bishops have spoken strongly for a Catholic commitment to ending the practice of the death penalty in the United States. And Catholics are playing a major role in this historic initiative in light of the Church's consistent ethic of life teaching. At the Mount, I teach a course on the death penalty with Vicki Schieber. And Vicki is a staff member for the Catholic Mobilizing Network to end the use of the death penalty. She's also a murder victim parent. Her daughter Shannon was killed over 14 years ago, raped and murdered. And she's also active in a number of murder victim family members organizations for persons who oppose the death penalty. A lot of people are very surprised that there are a significant number of family members of murder victims who stand passionately opposed to executions. Vicki is also a nationally recognized abolitionist. She's been honored by the U.S. bishops for her work in promoting the ethic of life that is at the center of Catholic teaching. She's also been a leading voice in a number of state commissions working to examine the issue of the death penalty. Vicki, David McCarthy, who is a colleague at Mount St. Mary's, he's a nationally recognized Catholic theologian. So Vicki, David McCarthy, and I worked on a book at the invitation of the Catholic Mobilizing Network. And we invited 13 faculty from a range of disciplines to come together for 2 years' exploration of this issue. And we ended up producing a book that we are actually very proud of. And the title of the book is Where Justice and Mercy Meet, Catholic Opposition to the Death Penalty. And this is a very good resource. Much of what I'll be touching on very, very briefly today is developed at great length in this. And so I strongly recommend that you draw on this. There's a lot of facts, there's a lot of information, takes you through the whole history of the Church's teaching on this, and it also brings you into narratives, stories about people who have lived this issue. Another book that I will reference indirectly, but I'd strongly recommend for you as a resource, that you read it and you also recommend other people read it. And this is a text produced by the U.S. Catholic bishops. It's called Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration, a Catholic Perspective on Crime and Criminal Justice. It's an excellent resource for beginning and also extending your understanding of Catholic social teaching on criminal justice. My university, which also has one of the largest seminaries in the country, has been very active on this issue. We offer courses, we've had state conferences, we've run lots of educational programs, all of which have been focused on fostering an understanding of the death penalty in general and also the Catholic stance on this practice. And we're very proud of the role that our university played in supporting the initiative which led last year to Maryland repealing the death penalty. Maryland became the 18th state in the country to repeal this practice. And this is very important because we're waiting for a tipping point at some point soon as we move into the 20s regarding states that have repealed. There is a reasonable expectation that then the Supreme Court will intervene and they will rule that the death penalty is a cruel and unusual practice, and it will be ended on a national level. So each state is very, very important in pushing us to this tipping point. You have an important role to play. As deacons, you can educate Catholics. You can educate them about this practice, and most importantly, about the Catholic Church's very strong position, well articulated, well conceived position on this, drawing on a broad understanding of Catholic social teaching and the moral tradition. So we have wonderful resources that can inform the state and national debate. In this program, I'm going to give you an update on two things. One is the current situation regarding the death penalty in this country. And this is actually an update that is filled with hope and promise. And then I'm also going to focus on the church's teaching. When we talk to various groups about the death penalty, whether it's on campus or off campus, it becomes very clear that what Sister Helen Prejean says is right. Sister Helen says support for the death penalty in the United States is a mile wide, but it's only an inch deep. Most Americans know very little about this practice. They don't have any personal contact with this practice, and they often haven't researched it and explored it the way you tend to do at a university. And what it becomes evident is the more people know about this practice, the more their support declines. The more they learn, they become troubled. And they especially become troubled on a moral level. And that speaks to Catholics in particular. A decade ago, we were very surprised to learn the extent to which Catholics didn't know about the Church's teaching. I'll be talking about different pronouncements, different teachings that have come forth and been clearly enunciated. But what was shocking is Catholics were not informed. Some people thought this is a tangential issue. It's not central to Catholic teaching. It's a matter of personal preference. It's probably more tied to a political stance. Some people actually thought the Church supported the death penalty. And other people were just unclear. What does the Church say about this? So many people were left to an uninformed personal stance. They didn't draw on the Catholic Church's teaching to inform their stance. So it appeared in many ways that the death penalty was the Catholic Church's best-kept secret. They had a very well-articulated position, but Catholics didn't know about it, so they couldn't come to understand it more deeply. Very fortunately, the situation has changed. There have been major efforts, and you'll play a role in furthering these efforts. There's been major efforts on an educational level, all the way from the Pope down to the laity. Papal speakings, teachings to clarify this position in great detail. The U.S. bishops have taken an active role. Catholic universities have taken an active role. Parish priests are beginning to talk about this issue. Catholic organizations like the Catholic Mobilizing Network. So gradually the laity are becoming more informed about this. And our hope is that as deacons, you can play a very important role in furthering this education of Catholics. I mentioned the book that we worked on. This book came out of our commitment to further this educational initiative. And we asked people for advice. We assume many people will read this book, but it was really targeting a Catholic audience. And we asked for advice, how do we frame it? What should we emphasize? How should we design and structure it? And we were very well advised. We were told to emphasize 2 points. And I recommend that you do the same thing when you are teaching as deacons. We were told to frame the issue very fundamentally as a moral issue. And a moral issue that is deeply grounded in Catholic moral teaching, especially its consistent ethic of life, and an ethic of justice that is always wedded with mercy, an ethic grounded in the imitation of Christ. The second point was we were told to put a human face on this issue. I'm a philosopher. Philosophers tend to deal with abstract arguments. Theologians also do that. But we were told, make sure you present the arguments in the book and when you're talking to people. But don't just focus on abstract arguments. Always draw people into the experience of people who live this reality. And most of us have nothing to do with the death penalty. It doesn't impact our lives at all. So for 2 years, we brought our faculty, either through direct encounters or through reading of narratives, to a very deep exposure to people who live the reality of the death penalty. murder victim family members, death row chaplains, prison personnel, wardens. All of this pushed us deeper and deeper into understanding not just the abstractions, but the lived realities. And the more you go into the lived realities of the death penalty, what comes forth is the moral dimensions. That's what you start recognizing. And these moral dimensions are deeply informed by Catholic beliefs and principles. So we followed the advice that we were given in designing the book, and I strongly recommend you follow this advice. Think and talk about the death penalty in terms of moral arguments and in terms of concrete human realities. Without any doubt, Catholics are playing a major role in the repeal of the death penalty. And I don't think it's just because of the leadership of the clergy, the leadership of the Pope, especially John Paul II and Pope Benedict. And we will hear probably over the next few years, Pope Francis. The strong involvement of the U.S. bishops, priests, nuns, but also because of the increasing engagement of the laity, and you will play a role in that. The Church has called for shared common action among Catholics on the parish level, the local level, the state level, the national level, the international level, to bring about the end of this practice, and sooner rather than later. And what's impressive is this call is being heard. Catholics are having a profound effect on this debate nationally and internationally. I'm going to give you some information at this point. Catholic support for the death penalty has been steadily declining in the last 2 decades. It has dropped significantly from 70% support in the late 1990s to now less than 48%. And it is anticipated that as Catholics learn more, that percentage will steadily continue to drop. A third of Catholics who once supported the death penalty now oppose it. And the percentage of Catholics who were strongly supportive of the use of the death penalty has dropped all the way down to 20%. Younger Catholics, and by that I mean people who are 18 to 29, and regular church attenders, are much more likely to oppose the death penalty. During the last 5 years, 6 states with strong Catholic populations, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, New Mexico, Illinois, and Maryland, have repealed. One after another, states are continuing to repeal the death penalty. New Hampshire and Delaware are heading in that direction. The expectation is soon they will be added to the number of states that have repealed. And the expectation, as I mentioned earlier, is that when this number reaches between 20 and 25, then we will reach a point where the Supreme Court will intervene, and they will end this practice. They will state that the United States will no longer have capital punishment because it is unusual and is unnecessary. And what's interesting at that point, we will never again be a member of an odd cohort. If you ask people, what are the countries in the world that have the highest execution rates? Very rarely would they list the United States. And when you tell them that the top 4 countries are China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, you can see the shock in their face. These are countries that our government and our citizens consistently criticize for human rights violations. So there's a moral uneasiness that in our punishment practices, this is our cohort. This is troubling. So hopefully soon, we will no longer be on that list. We will end this practice. And what fills us with hope is that Catholics are playing a significant role in building this momentum, and this should make us proud. It is unquestionably tied to the fact that Catholics are becoming increasingly more informed about the Catholic Church's stand. So you are called, as deacons, to play a significant role in the further education of Catholics on this issue. What I'd like to do now is give you some information about where we are in this country. What's the lay of the land in the current time regarding the death penalty? And then later, I'll move into what is your major interest, and that is the Church's position. It is clear there is a momentum building towards repeal in this country. It has been growing. It's been accelerating in the last 5 years. And at the same time, there's a decline in the use of the death penalty. Probably the only exception is Texas. This is a state that's clearly at odds with the momentum of the rest of the country and is most at odds with the Catholic Church's teaching on the death penalty. Executions are down. The number has declined each year since 2000. 43 executions in 2011, 42 in 2012, 39 in 2013, averaging a 40% drop from 1988, when there were 98 executions. In the 1930s, there was an average of 167 executions per year. So you can see this steady decline. 18 states have repealed. And even those states that still retain the death penalty are not executing people. So in many states, you have a de facto moratorium. They retain it, but they're uneasy about applying this practice. 7 retentionist states have had no executions in 10 years. 13 have had none in 5 years. I'll give you one example. California has 724 people on death row, but it's only executed 13 people since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. And it has not executed anyone since 2006. In my own state of Pennsylvania, there's 198 people on death row, but we haven't executed anyone since 1999. And we've only executed 3 people since reinstatement in 1976. And those 3 people were executed not because the state gave them a death warrant, but because they gave up their appeals. So clearly Pennsylvania is hesitant about applying this practice. Contrary to the assumption that the death penalty is widely practiced in this country, a recent study evidenced that actually the practice is found in a very, very small percentage of U.S. counties in a handful of states. Only 2% of the counties of the United States are responsible for the majority of death sentences and executions since 1976. So the practice of the death penalty is limited to a very small part of America, and the practice is declining. There are also fewer death sentences being given. Until the late 1990s, 300 defendants on average were sentenced to death each year. In 1999, 277 were sentenced. In 2003, 144. That's a 52% drop. And in 2011, only 78 people were sentenced to death, a 54% drop from 2003. So there's a steady decline in that area. The Supreme Court also continues to narrow the application of the death penalty. They keep narrowing it, and narrowing it, and narrowing it, probably because there is a moral concern about this application. And I'll give you just 2 examples. In the famous Atkins decision of 2002, the Supreme Court said we will no longer allow people with severe mental disabilities to be executed. But the fact is, they actually do continue to be executed. And the Supreme Court will have to return to this issue shortly. In the 2005 Roper decision, the Supreme Court ruled that we will no longer execute juveniles, children. A lot of people are shocked to learn the statistics about our executing juveniles in this country. Since reinstatement in 1976, 22 juveniles have been executed. That's morally troubling to people. I show my students pictures of 14-year-olds as they walk to their executions. Those pictures are deeply troubling to those students. The Roper ruling removed 72 juvenile inmates from death row in 2005. So we had 72 children set for executions. This is morally troubling to Americans. And the Supreme Court continues to endlessly grapple with the arbitrary and inconsistent application of the death penalty. They're endlessly issuing rulings, hundreds of rulings, tinkering with the procedure out of a hope that we can get it right, we can get it fair and just. A number of justices who in previous rulings, before they retired from the Supreme Court, were passionately supportive of the death penalty. And they have come out and said, if I had known then, I would never have supported. They stand no longer in support of the death penalty. And one has said, I will not have anything to do anymore with the tinkering with the machinery of death, with the illusion that we can finally get this procedure to be fair, consistent, and just. Many Americans have deep concerns about the death penalty. Some of them it's on a theoretical level. They don't support the practice. But many people are deeply concerned because of the actual reality of the practice, that it's riddled with inconsistencies, arbitrariness, unfairness. What has been a source of much recent debate is the prohibitively high cost of the death penalty. Some people are really surprised. They think the death penalty is less expensive than life without possibility of parole or life sentences. And this is not the case. And this economic dimension has played a major role in a number of states repealing and beginning to consider repealing. I'll give you an example. From a strictly financial perspective, the citizens of New Jersey were deeply troubled that taxpayers over the past 23 years had paid $250 million on a capital punishment system and had executed no one. They, like the bishops, concluded that these massive funds could be used to better protect people and to enhance the lives of New Jerseyans and to support murder victim families. So they repealed the death penalty, and it was mainly because of financial issues. All right. This book that I mentioned on the Catholic position on criminal justice emphasizes that economic issues have a moral dimension. What we do with our state funds matter. And to flagrantly waste funds on a prohibitively expensive punishment system when you could direct it to safeguarding people in communities, lowering the crime rate, supporting victims of crime, rehabilitation programs, all of these things would enable wiser, more moral allocation of our funds. All right? So this is very much developed in this text. Another issue, which is one of the major moral concerns of people, is the rising number of exonerees. These are people who are wrongly convicted. Some of them have spent 20, 25 years on death row for crimes that they had nothing to do with. The number of exonerated inmates right now is 143, and it will likely continue to rise. And this gets under the skin of people. This is a morally troubling issue. They're also troubled when they learn more about the death penalty by the fact that race, poverty, geographical location, and prosecutorial discretion play a significant role in the uneven, inconsistent application of the death penalty. Now, this troubles Catholics This is central to Catholic social teaching. If it is the case that the marginalized, the poor, and the powerless are the people who are at risk of death sentences, this is a moral issue. Catholics care about this type of issue. But even if all these practical problems could be addressed, if the application of the death penalty could be flawless, if we could perfectly apply death sentences, if we could make it wasn't so prohibitively expensive, if we could have no wrongful convictions, we could eliminate all these problems, still Catholic social teaching would oppose the death penalty on principle. I'd now like to turn what I'm sure is your major interest. What is the Catholic Church's teaching on this? Again, I'd recommend you read the chapters in this book, and that's the bulk of this book that we wrote, because it's a deep and rich and well-articulated position. So I'm just touching quickly, almost superficially, on things that have a great depth and a great importance, right? So hopefully from this, you'll learn some of the major principles, the stance the Catholic Church takes, but then you'll take this as an invitation to go deeper, to learn this in great depth with great insight, so then that you can be further educators and bring people into this educational dialogue. There are a number of fundamental principles that underlie the Church's teaching, and I'm going to try to bullet these, all right, so they're clearly stated. One you are already familiar with, but sometimes people don't apply this consistently. They almost have a blind eye in terms of the application. But this is a consistent position of the Church. So the first point, all human life possesses inherent dignity, which is never to be violated. That's a clear fundamental principle. Given that, both the victim and the perpetrator have inherent worth. That's a radical claim, and it's at the core of Christianity. All persons, no matter what they have done, no matter what the circumstances of their life are worthy of respect and ethical treatment. No matter how heinous the criminal act, the life of the offending person has God-given worth. We don't give them this worth. This is intrinsic to their very nature. What flows from this is the claim that no person is reductionistly and singly reducible to one act. Just pause for a minute and think of the act that would be the worst thing you've done in your life, that would fill you with shame and guilt. And what if everyone who associated with you reduced you singly to that individual act? All right. So this argues that humans are complex beings. We're multifaceted. We have a complexity, and that's our richness. So no one can be reduced to a single act. So what this comes down to fundamentally is the belief that convicted prisoners are human persons who, despite their crimes, deserve to be treated with the respect and dignity that they have. On the other side, victims of crimes are deserving of support during and following judicial procedures. There's a moral problem if we forget this, if we abandon them. And this is some of the reasons that murder victim family members oppose the death penalty. They recognize what the death penalty includes is decades of judicial procedures that have them returning again and again to what is probably the most horrific event of their life. Right? So we need to attend to the needs of murder victims. Another point, which is absolutely essential to Catholic teaching on this issue, is that punishment can never be reduced purely to a matter of retribution. Retribution has to do with justice. There's a kind of fairness in punishment. It must be commensurate, given the gravity of the crime. So it's not a question that justice is not important, but the Catholic Church's position is a rich and complex position regarding punishment, and we never can reduce it to one singular dimension. And this is especially important because easily retribution can slide into retaliation. It can slide even into vengeance, where we desire to do back the harm that was done to the victim. And this is not what undergirds Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching holds that punishment must be positively oriented. And the way this is framed in a rich term contrasted with retribution, mere retribution, is that punishment must be restorative. It must further the repentance and the reform of the evildoer. And this is modeled in the actions of Christ with sinners. And the aim is the restoration of the criminal, the restoration of the community. I mean, the goal would be, the ideal that we would seek is a goal of reconciliation that heals. Heals both the sinner and the person wronged, and also protects the good of society. So there's many levels to this understanding of criminal justice. But what drives it fundamentally is the image of Christ as the Good Shepherd. Not abandoning his flock, but taking a special attentiveness to the lost sheep. This is not understood sentimentally, but this is rooted in this vision of each person having intrinsic worth, right? So the individual who does wrong is not lost, is not driven away. They are worthy of being sought, recovered, and reconciled. So the teaching of Christ in the New Testament calls us to do many things: to protect life, to console and support those who have been harmed, and to practice mercy with justice, and at all costs to avoid vengeance, which is not virtuous. Both Vicki Schieber and I, and a lot of Catholics who do prison ministry, have seen the power of this position. When we visit death row inmates, I've been visiting a death row inmate for 14 years in Maryland. And you also see this when you work with murder victim family members, the power of this position, the transformative power of this position. Often when I go into the Maryland prison to visit the man that I have visited way over a decade, I pause to think, what would Christ think and do as he entered this prison, as he entered death row? In a very powerful chapter in the book, which is written by Sister Mary Kate Burge. She's a Catholic theologian and Josephite sister. She brings us into an exploration of the words and the actions of Christ. And she poses it very simply. What would Jesus do? Drawing on his words, and I'll mention a few things. She draws on the parable of the woman about to be stoned, the adulterous woman, the Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the prodigal son. So she draws on Jesus' stories, but also Jesus' actions, how he behaves the night of his suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane, and during his own execution, because at the center of Christian belief is an execution. how he behaved in the last moments on the cross. And what Sister Mary Kate argues is if you go deep into these words and actions, it becomes inconceivable that Christ would support the death penalty. Christ witnesses and powerfully calls us to an alternative response to sinful wrongdoing, a response that it is inconceivable that we would frame it in terms of violent retaliation. And he shapes for us the model of what is a Christian response to wrongdoing. Christ embodies and also witnesses this Christian response to evil in our world. What I'd like to do now is turn to some of the church documents that build upon this central witnessing. In the 20th century, there had been numerous papal appeals to end the death penalty based on a deepening clarification of the church's position. And I'd like to just run through a number of these. And I recommend that you read these. All right, I only have a moment to touch on their most salient points. But go and read these. Move deeply into these documents. In 1999, John Paul II very clearly stated in St. Louis, Missouri, these are his words: "The new evangelization calls for the followers of Christ who are unconditionally pro-life, unconditionally pro-life, to end the death penalty, which is both cruel and unnecessary." So he frames it in terms of this consistent, unified pro-life ethic. Pope Benedict appealed to the international community to end the use of the death penalty. And here I quote him: "I express my hope that your deliberations," and he was addressing himself to the Sant'Egidio community in Italy, "I express my hope that your deliberations will encourage the political and legislative initiatives being promoted to encourage in a growing number of countries to eliminate the death penalty and to continue the substantive progress made in conforming penal law both to the dignity of prisoners and effective maintenance of public order." It is very clear this is an international appeal to end the death penalty. Pope Benedict called, and these are his words, he called on, quote, "society's leaders to the need to make every effort, a passionate effort, a committed effort, to eliminate the death penalty and to reform the prison system in a way that ensures respect for the prisoner's human dignity." In their landmark 1980 statement on capital punishment, the U.S. bishops affirmed definitively, without any ambiguity, and I quote, "the recognition of the dignity of all human beings," and clarified that this affirmation, quote, "impelled the Church to minister to the needs of the outcast and the rejected, and should make us unwilling to treat the lives of even those who have taken human life as expendable or as a means to some further end." This seminal statement by the U.S. bishop called clearly, without any ambiguity, for an ending to the U.S. practice of the death penalty. In response to that, in 2005, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops launched an active campaign. So it wasn't just a question of understanding this position, but putting it into action. They called for an active campaign to end the use of the death penalty in the United States. And they issued a statement called "A Culture of Life and a Penalty of Death." The bishops clearly focused on the struggle that we know too well the struggle between a culture of life affirmed in Catholic social teaching and the violence that is so deeply embedded and glorified in our society today. So they set up this tension between Catholic social teaching and a dynamic we witness all too often in our society. Ours is a society that is increasingly committed to retaliatory violence. And that violence is foreign to the Gospels and Christ's witness. We know all too well this violence. You wait weekly for the latest manifestation of it and all the suffering that it causes. And Catholics are called to be countercultural in regard to this violence. What our book does is not only affirm these fundamental principles, but it takes a historical overview. It looks back through the developing articulation of this position in history within the Catholic Church and the clear articulation of it in our current century. And it lays out the scriptural, the Christological, and the catechetical foundations of the teaching on the death penalty. So it's an incredibly rich and deep understanding of the need to repeal the death penalty. I recommend 2 chapters by Monsignor Swetland. He's a vice president and a philosophy professor, and he also teaches theology at our college. He goes into a lengthy explanation of the traditional teaching on the death penalty as summarized in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I only have time to sketch the major points. And these are that the Church affirms, first, the right and duty of legitimate authority. By that he means the civil government. 2, this is a quote, inflict punishment proportionate to the gravity of the offense, and to protect public order and the safety of persons. This principle has never changed throughout the tradition. There is a moral responsibility for the civil government to give just punishment and to protect the common good. But the Catechism goes on to say, in contemporary society, where we have non-lethal means to do this, the state is not justified in using the death penalty. It is not justified in resorting to capital punishment. And the Catechism is very clear on this, and I'm going to use its words. This is from segment 2267 of the Catechism. If bloodless means are sufficient to defend human lives against an aggressor and to protect public order and the safety of persons, then public authority must limit itself to such means, because they better correspond to the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity with the dignity of the human person, end quote. Pope John Paul II was powerfully influential in articulating this. In his encyclical, The Gospel of Life, he says that executions would be justifiable only in cases of absolute necessity. And what he means by that is when it would not be possible to defend the common good except through them. And then he goes on to clarify that such conditions no longer exist in our advanced societies. We have maximum security prisons, and we can commit the funds that are now allocated to death sentences to increasing the security of those maximum security prisons. We can punish justly and in a way that ensures the protection of society without killing, and thereby uphold the ethic of life. He says we can do this and we must do this. Extending the catechism articulation, the bishop's statement, A Culture of Life and the Penalty of Death, very unambiguously reaffirmed this. And I'm quoting, "Our nation should forego the use of the death penalty because," and they articulate their reasons, "the sanction of death, when not necessary to protect life, to protect society, violates respect for human life. Secondly, state-sanctioned killing in our names diminishes all of us. Its application is deeply flawed, and it can be irreversibly wrong. It's prone to errors, it's biased by such factors as race, quality of legal representation, and where the crime was committed. Their final reason, we have other ways to punish criminals and to protect society," end quote. Their subsequent publication, entitled Life Matters, the Death Penalty, emphasized, and here's another quote, "Imprisonment is effective in removing the offender from society. Importantly, it allows time for repentance and for rehabilitation. And the one sure result of executing prisoners is to make people more vengeful, seeking retribution, satisfying our outrage at the violent crime by more violence. The death penalty just aggravates the injustices we have not yet been able to overcome," end quote. The bishops have made it clear that we must, and again I use their words, we must no longer try to teach that killing is wrong by killing those who kill. This cycle of violence diminishes all of us. Cardinal McCarrick repeatedly emphasized this. The death penalty is fundamentally wrong, not just because of what it does to the offender, but what it does to all of us in the community. For 15 years on my campus, I've been involved in promoting discussion of this issue. I think it's the responsibility of our campus as a Catholic university, and especially as the second oldest Catholic university. We have brought numerous scholarly speakers on the death penalty. We brought exonerated death row inmates, persons who've spent 10, 20, 25 years on death row for something they never had anything to do with. We brought death row chaplains, family members of the executed, murder victims. We've had hours spent in dialogue with faculty, students, and these people. I've had my students correspond with death row inmates. As I mentioned, I visit a man, I've been visiting him for 14 years, and he would have been the next person to be executed if Maryland had not repealed. But in all these people that we have encountered on our campus, I can say the most powerful persons that we've been graced to meet on our campus, of all the people who fill the pages of this book, the most powerful witnesses to this Christian position, this distinctly Catholic position, are Catholics like Marietta Yeager and Vicki Schieber. They were both mothers, they are both mothers, whose daughters were killed. Marietta Yeager lost her daughter, 6-year-old Susie. Vicki lost her daughter in her early 20s. Shannon was killed while she was beginning graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And these women summoned the strength to follow in the witness of Jesus in the most horrific experience of their lives. They refused. They refused to be consumed with the wrath of vengeance, which many people feel in relation to the loss of the child. They did not want to become the kind of person who would be filled with vengeance. And they also recognized the hatefulness of vengeance would destroy them. They refused to respond to the violent loss of life with more violence and the loss of another life. They refused to believe that an execution would heal their suffering. They refused to believe another killing would bring them the peace they sought. They refused to support the killing of someone in their children's name. But they creatively managed, they sought this, and they managed to find ways to positively honor the spirit and life of Susie and Shannon. And to everyone's amazement, when you meet these women, they did it joyfully, and they did it with grace. They were tested, and they somehow found the strength to retain their commitment to the principles and beliefs that I've been talking about. Vicky's husband, Syl, often says, if you don't hold to your Christian principles when it's difficult, then they weren't your principles. So this experience that they went through, which they would not wish for anyone, was the test of whether they held strongly to these principles. And they passed that test. And every day they witness the passing of that test. To everyone's amazement, and I think this is what is most amazing about their witness, what they prayed for was that in imitation of Christ on the cross, they could reach the point that they could forgive, and that they could be reconciled with, and they could respond eventually compassionately to their child's killer. That was their prayer. And they did this in imitation of Christ. They understood Catholic moral teaching, and they managed to live it consistently. As we finished the work on this book, we had to make a decision. To whom do we dedicate the book? And as we began to talk about this, it was crystal clear to me. To whom should we dedicate? We rightly dedicated the book to the numerous, quite numerous, Catholic murder victim family members like Marietta and Syl and Vicky. And this is the words we chose. We dedicate it to those who focus on forgiveness and restorative justice in response to their deep loss and suffering. Your witness fills us with hope. Their faith was what sustained them, and it enabled them to live charitably, lovingly. And this kind of witness fills every single person they encounter with deep hope. Because it's one thing for Christ to live this, but to encounter a person who actually lives this imitation of Christ is amazing. In many ways, what the popes and bishops have articulated and what they have called us to do is to walk in the witness of these people, to walk the way they walk in imitation of the life of Christ, in a way that we understand and live the beliefs that are central to Christianity. In writing our book, we were very well advised to focus on the stories of people, not to stay on the abstract level, to focus on people who live the realities of the death penalty, and to focus most closely on people like Marietta and Vicky and Syl, who, not broken by their tragedy and suffering, were amazingly able to transform that evil into something good, and in a way that continues to honor those they deeply love, and in many ways to honor each and every one of us. These are individuals who show us how to unite justice and mercy, and how to consistently affirm human life. My hope is that you as deacons will be able to call persons to know about this witness and to follow this witness. So I end by wishing you the very best as you continue your journey of deeply understanding, teaching, and living this consistent ethic of life. In wishing you well, as you play a very important role in the formation of Catholics, and they're coming to better understand and live Catholic teaching, I don't want to minimize the challenge. We've been talking about an issue that is not well understood by Americans. It's not well understood by Catholics. So I think what you're doing is you're inviting people into a very important reflection. And the important thing is that they begin that reflection, that journey of reflection. And that you recognize confusions, uncertainties, hesitancies on their part. So in some ways, in talking about this issue, you have to be very patient. And I think in many ways, we have to model what is central to this teaching, which is respect for persons. And one would assume these people want to live good and decent lives. They want to live in light of a moral compass. Some of them might not have a position. Some of them may be pro-death penalty. So your role is to bring them to begin a journey. That how can they better understand Catholic social and moral teaching as it bears on this important topic. And that's extremely challenging. So I would encourage you to be very patient, to be very invitational, to welcome people into an exploration of something that they may not truly understand, and they may not reach the point that they have a strong commitment to it. But to convey to these people the Catholic Church has a rich, well-articulated position here that is worth their careful, sustained reflection about. And some of the beliefs that are essential to this that we've articulated, and some of the facts that the majority of Americans know very little about. If you concede and you can encourage reflection on this and bring people to see that what the strength of the Catholic position is a consistent ethical stand that focuses fundamentally on the intrinsic worth and dignity of human persons. And this leads to a whole range of ethical positions that you're exploring in this deacon course. That a person from conception to their natural death has inherent worth, is worthy of respect, and the promotion of the goods of this person. And if you can emphasize that, and then bring them to consider, in light of that teaching, and in light of the witness of Christ, what should be their stand on the death penalty? And you have a major role to play in inviting and getting people to begin this journey of understanding the Catholic position in opposition to the death penalty.